Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just pass on these. A very, very minimalistic sort of handout. It just covers 3 theses that I'm going to refer to throughout the talk. Well, hello. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I'm flattered to have been invited, and it's a real pleasure and delight to be here. I'll put this up now. I thought I'd do some pictures, basically, to kind of hopefully liven things up. And then I realised that I didn't have very many photos because I don't actually have a camera, and I rely on other people to take photos of me whenever I go climbing. And so I got my friend Philip Ebert to send me some stuff. And then I realised all the stuff he sent me was pictures of me, and it's going to seem very, very narcissistic. I apologise for that. It wasn't intentional. But I did it nonetheless, I guess. In that sense, it was intentional. Right, yes, I'm going to be talking about mountaineering and the value of risk. I guess my main interests in philosophy and my research are really in both ethics, contemporary ethics, and Nietzsche. But I also do a bit of thinking about philosophical issues that emerge in the context of mountaineering. And that's in part because mountaineering is, I guess, my main passion outside of philosophy. What I'm going to be talking about today is a developed or expanded version of part of a paper that I co-wrote with Philip Ebert on the same sorts of issues. But what we did in that earlier paper was start off from what we take to be an apparent disagreement between mountaineers on the one hand and then people who maybe don't know so much about mountaineering on the other hand. And they tend to have some kind of disagreement about the risks that are involved in mountaineering. And we looked at various ways in which we might try to resolve this disagreement. And our basic thought was that it's not actually a disagreement about how risky the activity is, but it's actually a debate, or the disagreement is an issue about whether the risks involved in mountaineering are actually justified. So in that sense, it's a kind of normative issue rather than just a matter of the quantity or degree of risk. We also looked at a number of statistics to see if they could cast any light whatsoever on how risky mountaineering is, by comparing various sorts of statistics that crop up in mountaineering about fatality rates and injury rates with other sorts of activities. But we thought that actually these statistics are pretty useless in that respect. And then in the third part of the paper, we then turned to these kind of normative issues, and I'm now trying to develop this into a longer paper, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here. So one thing I want to say at the start is that mountaineering is a risky activity. Indeed, I think it's an eliminable component of mountaineering that it involves risk. So risk is an essential, ineliminable aspect of it. And I think that a lot of people are sympathetic to what on the handout there and what I'm going to call this thesis risky. But mountaineering is not justified, and that's at least in part because of the risks that it involves. Now, I think this seems true when I talk to people, friends in the pub and so on. They kind of just don't kind of get what you do, and they think it's really risky. And I think that the notorious question that mountaineers are often asked, why do you do this, is informed by something like this thesis. Now, why do you climb? It's a sort of question that admits lots of different possible types of answer. So there have been various psychological sorts of answers given by psychologists, psychoanalysts. You can also give evolutionary biological accounts, sociological, anthropological answers to these sorts of things as well. But if you ask a mountaineer why he or she climbs, they very rarely try to give an answer that's in the third personal terms of those sorts of social sciences, or socio-biological sciences. Rather, what they do is typically draw attention to the features of mountaineering that they themselves find appealing or attractive. So they might mention the aesthetic beauty of being out in the mountains, or the aesthetic appeal of a certain climbing route on the face. It might just sort of grab their attention and look a really nice thing to climb. And they'll often talk about things like the satisfaction they get from moving in a fluent way over the medium upon which they're climbing, and problem solving, and various other sorts of things. But when we say these sorts of things to people who maybe don't climb, they kind of go, okay, I can sort of maybe see what you mean, but it's still not justified. And that's just because it's too risky. All these other things, they might be good, but it's still just too risky to make those other things kind of overall worth it, or to make the whole activity overall justified. So I think that this kind of thesis is actually informing a lot of people who are sceptical about mountaineering, and they think it's too risky. It's too risky to be justified. Now, there hasn't been a whole lot written on the topic of whether risk is justified in mountaineering. But what has been written on this, apart from by myself, I guess, tries to respond to that with a second thesis. So this is something of an orthodoxy now, I think, or it's a growing orthodoxy in the literature on this topic. So people oppose risking, or a number of philosophers have done so, by saying, look, mountaineering often is justified. When it's justified despite the risks that it involves. And it's justified by the further goods, which are distinct from risk, that it brings. But it's not justified by the risks themselves. So I'm going to call this the despite thesis. Now, I want to oppose the risky thesis in this talk, but I don't think that the despite thesis is a good way to oppose the risky thesis. I'm going to draw attention to some worries I have with this despite thesis. And so, going out on a limb, I guess, what I want to do is make a case for what I'm calling the because view. So mountaineering can be justified, and that's at least in part because of the value that engaging with mountaineering risks actually has. So that's what I'm going to be arguing for. I'm just going to structure things as follows. So I'm going to make some very quick preliminary points about some of the basic concepts like risk and so on. And then I'll look at a couple of arguments for the despite view, and I'll argue against those. Then in the rest of the talk, I'll give this kind of programmatic case for why I think because is plausible. There's a seventh section there, objections and responses, but just I think for the sake of time I won't go through that myself. I'm sure you'll have a number of objections, which I welcome, to try and improve the paper, or give it up if it's hopeless. Right, so a number of preliminary points then. So a lot of people have different views about risk. Happy to talk about other conceptions, but I think the dominant conception in various social sciences goes like this. So risk is understood as the combination of two factors. On the one hand, it involves, or risk is understood as the likelihood of there being a bad outcome in the context of mountaineering, a bad outcome resulting from a specific mountaineering endeavour. And the bad outcome would typically be injury or death. And it's also going to then involve something to do with the seriousness of the loss to that person who suffers the bad outcome, were that bad outcome to occur. So it's going to be some combination of these. And I take it it's going to be some sort of aggregative combination, in the sense, very roughly, that if you held one of them constant but increased the other, so if you held the likelihood of, say, falling off constant, but added, well, if the seriousness of the loss was then increased, then the overall risk would increase. If either of these increases, then the overall risk increases. A next point, so what do I mean by mountaineering? Well, I'm certainly not going to try and give a definition of that. Basically, I'm going to just focus upon ascents and hopefully descents of mountain routes, which would be attempted by relatively small groups in what is often called alpine style, where this is going to involve some actual kind of climbing, as in with your kind of hands, not just walking. Alpine style is basically a style of climbing in which the climbers take everything they need with them to ascend and descend the route. And so they don't prefix ropes and then come back down, go up the fixed ropes, restock camps and so on and do it like that. They just take everything with them and they go up in a continuous push up and down. And this could take a day or it could take several days to do. And it is one of the more committing and more risky styles of mountaineering. So I'm not going to be kind of stacking any cards or decks in my favour here. When it comes to mountaineering risks, there are all sorts of risks that are involved in mountaineering. There can be, for example, what are often called objective dangers due to things like avalanches and rockfalls. There are also going to be things like physiological conditions that you might encounter, especially at altitude, various kinds of edema, and then also things like hypothermia. there are also going to be risks of, say, basically getting lost. So you might be on a big mountain face, and the risk will be heightened if you can't see exactly where you're going and if you end up, say, going up a wrong route. There's also, though, what we might just call the residual risk of falling off. I'm calling it a residual risk in the sense that it's a more or less continuous kind of risk that confronts a mountaineer. And that's the kind of risk that really I'm going to be focusing upon. It's slightly artificial to do that because the risk of falling off can be exacerbated by these other sorts of factors. And so if you're suffering from some physiological malady, that's going to make you more likely to fall off, and so on and so forth. But that at least is what I'm going to be focusing on here. And then just to reiterate, so I am granting that risk is an ineliminable part of the activity. So these three theses, is important to note, if you just read them straight off, they look incredibly implausible, all of them. They're not supposed to be expressing necessary truths. I think the most plausible way to see them is as generalizations, which can have exceptions. And in this sense, we could just call them defeasible generalizations. So there will be some exceptions to them, but in defending the because thesis, what I'm essentially trying to do is get to one thing that I think is at the core of what's valuable about mountaineering, and use that to then say, at least in some instances, perhaps a lot of instances, mountaineering can be justified in virtue of the value that these risks have. But it is going to be subject to exceptions. I'm happy to grant that, so it's defeasible in that respect. Right, so what I'll do now is look at a first argument for this despite thesis. And this comes from a philosopher called Kevin Crine. And he presents three different theses that are supposed to support this idea that mountaineering can be justified, but is justified despite the risks. So he wants to emphasise, firstly, that mountaineers are not reckless risk seekers. Secondly, he says that it's false that, as he puts it, the point of risk activities like mountaineering is to take risks. And then he says that the point, and indeed value of mountaineering, consists in goods which are distinct from and do not depend for their value on risk. He thinks that the first two theses here are kind of mutually supporting, and he thinks that they in turn would motivate the third thesis. So I'm going to say something about certainly the first two theses in turn. I'm going to argue that the second thesis, which is his main point, doesn't really work, and so he doesn't motivate this third point either. Right, so the first thesis then. Apologies for the yellow, I couldn't find a better colour to do it in. Anyway, there we go. So, first thesis, mountaineers are not reckless risk seekers. They're not kind of flagrant adrenaline junkies as part of the idea. Now, I agree with this. I don't really know what Crine actually means. I'm not going to go into details of this to bore you that much. But I'm happy to agree with this thesis so long as we also allow that mountaineers do intentionally put themselves into situations that are risky, but they do so in the belief that they can and indeed will reduce or control the risk to what they judge is an acceptable level. But I don't think that that first thesis does support the second thesis, contrary to what Crine thinks, because one of the points of mountaineering could be to take risks that you believe you can control, or risks that you believe are acceptable. But I'm happy to accept the first thesis in that sense. What about the second thesis then? So Crine's claim is that it's false that the point of mountaineering is to take risks. Well, there's a kind of a stronger and a weaker way of reading this, depending on how we understand his talk of the point. Very, very vague, and he's not very clear either on that. Very roughly, I think, by the point, he means something like those things, those features of mountaineering that explain why mountaineers do it, the features they find attractive about it, that motivate them, or the kind of the aims or objectives that inform why they actually go climbing. So the strong way to read this claim, this second claim, would be to say that risk plays absolutely no role whatsoever in explaining why mountaineers climb. A slightly weaker way to be reading it would be to say that it plays at most a very, very minor role. I'm going to suggest that the strong version, that it plays no role whatsoever, is far too strong to be plausible. I'm not persuaded either by the weaker reading. So I'll just say something about both of those. So I think firstly it's too strong to say that the point of mountaineering cannot be risk. Apart from anything else, different mountaineers may be motivated by different sorts of things. On the other hand, I think also that mountaineers would not actually be able to mountaineer if there were no risk, because mountaineering is essentially and ineliminably a risky activity. But more important than that, I think, we can employ a few thought experiments and a few questions that we might ask mountaineers, and in fact I have asked friends who climb. So here are some questions that we could ask people. So if you believed that climbing the route would involve almost no risk, would you have climbed it? Or would you climb it? They usually say no. Another question, do you always prefer to climb a comparatively non-risky route rather than the more risky route? Uniformly, no. They do sometimes choose slightly more risky routes. Likewise, did you do everything in your power to eliminate all the risks whilst climbing? And again, they say, at least if they're being honest, they say no. So often what climbers do, if they're using ropes for example, is put in bits of protection, and they clip the rope into these and then they carry on up. So what would happen if you say put a bit of protection in here, you're say 5 metres above it there on the rope, if you fell off you'd then kind of fall 10 metres. But often they could put intermediate bits of gear in, rather than just say every 10 metres, but often they don't do that. These thoughts are supposed to be, I guess, motivating the idea that risk might well have something to do with what actually motivates them. And another kind of thought experiment we could maybe employ here is say, okay, usually climbers will just climb up with ropes and so on up a big face. But now imagine that we could instead put a big, huge metal cable coming down from the top down to the bottom of this mountain route. It's a thought experiment because it's probably not super easy to do. Though actually, anyway, I won't go into that. Right, so climbers could clip into the bottom, they'd be attached to this metal cable all the way up, and it would be pretty much safe. It would be very, very, well, a lot less risky anyway than climbing otherwise. Ask a mountaineer, would you prefer that kind of top rope steel cable route, or to climb it normal style, where there really is the risk of falling off? Well, not just do mountaineers say, well, yeah, of course I prefer to climb it the usual traditional style. They usually express a lot of disdain for the top rope suggestion. So again, I think that suggests that something to do with risk is likely to be there in the kind of the motivating sort of setup, that explains why climbers do it. So I think that it's too strong certainly to say that risk has nothing to do with why mountaineers climb, nothing to do with the point of mountaineering. And I think it's at least not implausible to say that it plays a little bit more than a merely minor role. We can discuss that. It's going to, I guess, end up with a lot of issues about vagueness and so on anyway. But even if I'm correct on that, Crine does actually have an argument for this second thesis. So given that he's got an argument for it, I'm going to need to look at his argument. Sorry, I should have gone through that already. So here's his argument for it. So he thinks that mountaineering produces a lot of goods. So I will go back to this last style. So he thinks that what actually justifies mountaineering is that it allows for a certain kind of interaction with nature, he says. True. A certain kind of freedom from various social and rule-governed sort of constraints. Again, it seems plausible. And the overcoming of challenges. And he also says that one of the things that can give it its value is what he calls the experiential goods that it brings. So experiences or feelings of exhilaration, and then also attending senses of personal fulfillment. So here's his argument then for the second thesis. So mountaineering produces these sorts of experiential goods like exhilaration, But he adds that it's very unlikely that the point is to take risks, and that's because of two other claims. Firstly, or claim A, he says that considerable effort and sacrifice are required to become a competent mountaineer. That seems true to me. But also he says that there are easier ways to experience these goods like exhilaration than through mountaineering. He actually mentions driving fast and playing Russian roulette. So the thought is you can get exhilaration through driving recklessly or fast and playing Russian roulette. But I think that claim B is actually, in a sense, false. And that's because the kinds of exhilaration and fulfilment that mountaineers get from facing and overcoming the risks involved in mountaineering are typically quite specific to mountaineering. They cannot be replicated through activities like Russian roulette or driving fast. So mountaineering and overcoming mountaineering risks involves often surmounting technically difficult or exposed or unprotected, in other words, dangerous, risky climbs. It can involve being isolated and committed on a big mountain face, knowing that if something goes wrong, then the repercussions will be quite serious or grave. And it can also involve the experience of prolonged physical and psychological adversity that can in turn make the whole endeavour more risky. And my thought is that if you took all these elements away, then whatever experiences of exhilaration the mountaineer would be left with, whatever kinds of fulfilment they get, they would be qualitatively very different from the kind of experience of risk and exhilaration mountaineers get from that in a mountaineering situation. So sure, you can get exhilaration from these other kinds of activities, like driving fast. But the kind of exhilaration that is involved in mountaineering is very different from that generated by these other activities. And I think that it can't be easily replicated by them. Just as a kind of anecdotal story to, I guess, further explicate this idea, there's a kind of poignant report in an autobiography by French climber Lionel Terray about his friend Louis Lachenal. So there'd been two people within a party who had made the first ascent of Annapurna, which I think was the first ascent of any of the 8,000 metre peaks in the Himalayas. Lachenal went to the top, but he suffered serious frostbite. And when they got back to France, he was unable to climb anywhere near the standard that he used to be able to due to having amputations due to his frostbite. And Terray describes how he was really like a bird with clipped wings. He did try to replace the kinds of exhilaration and excitement he got from mountaineering by basically driving very, very recklessly. But he just never managed to kind of get the same fulfillment again through climbing. And so the thought here is that this at least might suggest that the kind of exhilaration you get through climbing or mountaineering is often quite specific to that kind of activity and just can't be easily replicated in these other sorts of ways. There isn't a very easy surrogate, so to speak. So I think, therefore, that it's not at least obvious that part B is true. And if that's the case, then I think that to insist that it's false that the point of mountaineering is to take risks, even in the weaker way, or at least I don't think Krine's argument for that really stands up. Kind of to take the bigger picture, I think there are two general problems, though, with Krine's approach. So one is this: I'm not going to put very much emphasis on the first point, I guess. But even if the point of mountaineering, the thing that explains why mountaineers do it, is not to take risks, it doesn't follow that risk isn't one of the things that actually makes mountaineering valuable. Claims about human motivation and claims about value are at least arguably distinct sorts of claims. One's a psychological claim, the other's a normative or evaluative claim. But the second thing that I think is very misguided about his approach is its underlying assumption that risks are just means to other independently specifiable goods. And Krine, in fact, suggests that taking risks in mountaineering is pretty much an unfortunate or undesirable means to these other goods that he mentions, like interaction with nature and exhilaration and so on. It's as if mountaineers would just eliminate the risks entirely if only they could. That's the kind of tone in which he writes. That's an assumption that I'm going to be questioning. And what I want to say is a better view, and I'm going to explain this as we carry on, is that risk-taking is not just a means to various goods that it brings about, but it's constitutively bound up with the very activity of mountaineering. It's a constitutive and ineliminable part of these. And rather than being instrumentally valuable to bringing about these other goods, which are distinct from risk, it's constitutively valuable. That's the kind of thesis that in the sort of second part of the positive part of the talk I'll be developing. So I'll say a bit more about that there. But I guess just to sort of say one thing before I move on to the second despite argument, is that what I was trying to, I guess, get at with that anecdote is that taking risk is not just a means to, say, exhilaration. Rather, the kinds of exhilaration you get require you're actually taking these risks. And they would not have the same character unless you took those particular kinds of mountaineering risks. So the mountaineering type of exhilaration requires you're taking the mountaineering kinds of risks. That can't be replicated in other ways. And in that sense, the risk in mountaineering is constitutively bound up with mountaineering kinds of exhilaration. As I say, I'll return to the wider significance a bit later. Here's a second version of the despite thesis. And if you can see that, it looks like, and if you know about climbing, it looks like my rope work is pretty horrendous there. Actually, it was okay, but about 5 feet later it got really horrendous and became pretty incompetent, to be honest. Anyway, that's okay. Right, so a second argument for despite then. So the idea is that mountaineering is justified, and it's justified despite the risks, since, or insofar as it helps cultivate virtues of character that in turn enable us to live a better life. And the people who have advanced this insist that, or tend to say, a morally better life. So basically, taking risks in mountaineering can be valuable because it's going to make you a morally better person. To put this very politely, I guess I think this is a rather optimistic view of human nature and the effects that it has on, and the effects that mountaineering has on individual people. To put it somewhat more bluntly, I guess I just think that this is a trite, moralistic, pious, often self-serving fiction, basically. So, but here are some of the suggestions that have actually been touted in what's been written on this topic. So people say that facing and overcoming risks involves doing things that help cultivate virtues like courage. Coming to appreciate that the risks are sometimes too severe or difficult to overcome can cultivate qualities like humility. And helping others whilst putting one's own life at risk can develop virtues like compassion. I guess I have two objections to this. So the first one is that it may or may not cultivate these kinds of virtues. It's going to be highly person dependent. And it's also not clear whether these sorts of virtues or qualities that may be cultivated in mountaineering are actually going to transfer to the rest of one's life in the way needed to be a morally better person. Certainly, there are many mountaineers who do not come across as particularly compassionate or humble from personal experience and from reading a lot of mountaineering literature. That seems empirically false. But there's another worry about this, and it's the worry that it just gives basically the wrong kind of I was going to say something. I love this quotation. So here's a guy called Dudley Knowles, who he used to be the landlord of a notorious climbers pub in Glencoe, and he was also quite a good climber in his day. And he's now a professor of moral philosophy, or he was until he retired a year or so ago at the University of Glasgow, so a professor of moral philosophy. And here's what he said in response to the thought that climbing can make you a better person. And this is actually published in the Philosophical Quarterly, in a review where a number of the people advancing this despite thesis have been making these claims. So, can climbing make you a better person? He says, I suppose it can, but I have grave doubts. Long experience of both sides of a bar, where climbers drink, convinced me that climbers are no better people than bridge players or philosophers. But, he goes on to immediately add, they are probably better at fighting. So I think this kind of works quite nicely on a number of different levels. And I think, well, the second objection I have to this despite thesis is just that it gives the wrong kind of explanation or justification as to why mountaineering might be valuable. What it does is basically try to justify mountaineering values in terms of moral values. That's why I call it a kind of moralistic explanation or justification. It just seems to give to me the wrong kind of account of what might be valuable about mountaineering. Right. So what I'm going to do then from here on in is try to develop the positive idea about because and that thesis. So mountaineering can be justified because of the risks that it involves and the value that those risks have. So I've been talking loosely so far about risk-taking and risks and so on. What is it exactly about risk that might have value? Well, risks can go wrong. So I don't want to just say that taking risks is valuable, at least not always. We might amend that by saying that taking and overcoming risks is what's valuable in mountaineering, if indeed mountaineering is valuable. But I don't think that's quite right either. So you could take and overcome a risk, but you might succeed in overcoming it through pure good fortune or chance, through pure luck, or just as an utter fluke. So what I want to instead say is that engaging with mountaineering risks has value when the risk is taken and overcome competently. What does competence involve? Well, it's going to involve a number of different things, but I'll just mention two here. So, on the one hand, to be competent in mountaineering, the risk taker or the mountaineer must be warranted in believing, in light of the evidence available to her, for example, evidence concerning the route she's going to climb and also her own abilities, that she actually has the skill to succeed on the route. A lot more could be said about this. So the notion of warranty might be understood in terms of justification. But either way, it's not meant to be factive. So you might actually be justified or warranted in believing that you've got the ability to succeed here, but your belief might actually be false. But based on the evidence available to you, it's got to at least look like you're justified in believing that you will succeed. But you could be mistaken about the evidence, because you might not be aware of all the evidence. I won't say or put very much on that. But the other idea of competence here is that taking and overcoming the risk must be executed with a sufficient degree of climbing or mountaineering skill. So these are two of these central elements of competence that I have in mind. That's what's going to be sort of involved in taking and overcoming risks competently. You've got to have made the right kinds of judgments about whether to climb it, and you've got to be quite competent in actually climbing. This is so narcissistic, isn't it? A second set of points. So I want to say that risk-taking in mountaineering has value in relation to various other valuable features of mountaineering. On the one hand, I think there are all sorts of things that are these are now kind of high-flying, high-faluted sort of claims about what might be valuable about mountaineering. So it kind of satisfies deep human urges for a quest for adventure, exploration. These are things people often, I think the general public might say, if it's valuable at all, these are the sorts of things in virtue of which it's valuable. Then it can involve overcoming challenges. It can involve the telling of incredible skill and determination and so on. So I think that whether or not they really think that mountaineering endeavours are justified, people do tend to think that was really adventurous, and in virtue of that it was admirable or it was impressive, for example. So there's at least some value attached to these sorts of things, and I think most people would agree on that. So mountaineering is going to be valuable at least partly due to the sorts of goods like this that it helps realise, or that it expresses. And then there are also various experiential goods, as I'll continue to call these. It's a slightly misleading label. I'll come back to a proviso in a moment or two. So what do I mean by experiential goods? Well, I guess I'm thinking again of exhilaration. And this can manifest in all sorts of different ways. So one way in which it can manifest is what we might just call feeling alive. There's a lovely quotation in Hegel where he says something to the effect, I haven't been able to find this, I've been looking for hours, I can't find it, or re-find it. But he says something like, you feel most alive when you're closest to death. but then you overcome it. That's the sort of idea that I have in mind here. Climbers often talk about feeling in the zone. That's kind of also part of what's going on. Now, this could be a kind of supercharged adrenaline rush, but it need not be. It could be a far more kind of serene, meditative kind of quality that mountaineers experience when they're actually climbing. They often report how there's a kind of heightened sense of focus upon and a heightened appreciation of yourself and also at the same time your surroundings, the bits that you're climbing or the immediate climbing sort of arena around you. And features of your situation often take on a very kind of intense and sort of intensified quality. But you can also experience a kind of wholeness in which you're not only vividly aware of things around you, but you also kind of feel at one with everything around you. It's very difficult to kind of explain this without kind of having experienced it. But in terms of just the phenomenology, it's this sort of feeling of oneness and feeling of utter exhilaration at being part of everything that's around you that climbers often get when they are taking and overcoming risks. And these experiences of exhilaration can often extend long after the actual dangers or risks are over. And another important good that I think mountaineering realises in this kind of broadly experiential category is that through mountaineering you can express yourself as an effective agent. This is an idea that I got from some people who work on Nietzsche, in fact. They think that being or expressing yourself as an effective agent is basically a fundamental human good. So one thing that this would involve is basically achieving the things that you set out to achieve. So for a mountaineer, it would be competently overcoming the risks that are involved in getting to the top of a route, for example. And at a more specific level, it could involve the experience of moving competently, fluently, or in control. So moving fluently in the medium that you're climbing in. And it can give a deeply gratifying experience of being an effective agent here, because you're actually in control of everything you're doing, and you can sort of really sense and experience that control. And it is very satisfying. But it can also involve expressing something about who you really are, and what's deeply important to you. So many mountaineers do talk about how climbing is something that they need to do in order to really be who they are, in order to express themselves. And I think this plausibly is why they do get a deep sense of exhilaration and fulfillment from it. And they often do feel that they're kind of thwarted when they're unable to get outside and go climbing. So it's kind of coming back to this idea of effective agency. This is the way in which they are basically effective agents or effective at action by doing the things that they love doing. And that involves overcoming these risks. I do want to add to that, though, that it's not just the experience of, say, exhilaration that is valuable, but it's the experience that's produced by actually taking and overcoming risks. So if you know about, say, Nozick's experience machine, that's supposed to provide some doubts about experiential accounts of value. So I'm not trying to give an experiential account of value here, except insofar as I'm saying experiences are valuable, like exhilaration, but only insofar as they actually do involve overcoming the risks. So it's not the mere experience, but it's the experience grounded in actually taking and overcoming the risks competently. So anyway, there are kind of two general types of mountaineering good. These kind of highfalutin, the spirit of human nature kind of goods to do with adventure and so on. And then also these kind of ideas about experiential goods in the broad sense, including effective agency. Now, what I've said so far is compatible with the despite thesis, however. So it could be that mountaineering is justified despite the risks simply because it brings these other sorts of goods, like it allows you to be an effective agent, it allows you to, or allows people to do adventurous things, and so forth. But I don't want to say that. So what I want to say firstly, in contrast to the despite thesis, is that risk is not instrumentally valuable to these other goods, but it's constitutively valuable. And in particular, there's a kind of co-constituting relation between risk and these other values I mentioned about adventure, etc., and effective agency and exhilaration. So it's co-constitutive in this sort of following sense, that risk has value, partly in virtue of the value of the goods, like adventure and exhilaration, that it helps to realise. And these are goods that most people would say are indeed good, they are valuable. At least most people, I think, outside the mountaineering context would agree with mountaineers that exhilaration and being an effective agent and adventure are, to some degree, good. But also, mountaineering goods have the value they do, partly because of the risks that they involve. And the basic idea behind that second point, or point B, is this. So I suggested before that risk is a constitutive and ineliminable element of mountaineering, and the character or the particular type of experience that mountaineering brings. So, since the value of mountaineering depends in part on the character of the experiences that it brings, the value of mountaineering will also depend then on the risks that it involves. And so mountaineering and the goods that it brings will have the particular kind of value they do, in part because of the risks that they involve. Now this is meant to be distinct from the despite thesis, because risk is not here understood as a mere kind of causal means to various mountaineering goods. These goods are not actually distinct from the risk, because risk is an ineliminable and constitutive part of them. And it's therefore partly because of the risk that mountaineering is valuable. So it's not just an instrument or a means to achieving these valuable things. Rather, so here's the difference, I guess, between what I mean by mere means and something being constitutive. So if we talk about something as a means to an end, we usually think we can kind of specify what the end is, and then it's just a matter of working out what the means to it are. What the means are won't actually affect or change the end itself. But with a constituent, the idea is that the constituent is actually kind of part of the end. Or to put it a slightly different way, the character of the constituent kind of shapes the character or the nature of the end. So in this sense, risk would be constitutively valuable because it actually is a constitutive part of mountaineering itself. It's not merely a means to some other good which is distinct from it, mountaineering, rather it's a part of mountaineering itself. And in that sense then, mountaineering has the value it does, in part because of the risks that it involves. So in short, there are various goods to which mountaineering, that mountaineering expresses or realises. These goods have the character they do because they involve taking and overcoming risks. And so in that sense, risk is a constitutive part of mountaineering, and in that sense it's constitutively valuable, I think. So mountaineering then has the value it does, at least in part because of the risks that it involves. So just a couple more minutes. Now, even if you accept what I've said there about the value claim, that's not going to actually get us to the because thesis. So the because thesis is not just a claim about value, but it's a claim about justification. Something could be valuable, but not overall justified. So here's a kind of way to present this as an objection to my thesis so far, my argument so far. So we might say, okay, risk-taking can be valuable, let's grant that. But nonetheless, its value may be overridden by its disvalue. And plausibly, if that's the case, then the risk-taking would not be justified overall. So it might be valuable to some extent, but not valuable enough to be justified, because the risks are also too disvaluable. Now, I'm not going to offer a direct argument to get from the value claim to the because claim, to the full-blown because. But what I think I can do is give a kind of indirect argument. It's indirect in the sense that if we can block that kind of objection to it, then I think that we're at least kind of default entitled to assert because in light of the claims about value. So that seems to me the most obvious way to deny the move from the value claims about how risk is mountaineering is valuable in partly because of the risk, from that claim to the claim that it's justified because of the risk. That looks like the most obvious way to deny it. If we can block that move, then I think that we're at least, absent any other arguments, entitled to get to that conclusion about because. So here's, I guess, what I want to say. So why that kind of objection doesn't work. I think it's just difficult to see why competent risk engagement would be disvaluable in the ways that are needed to render all mountaineering endeavours unjustified. So competence here is playing a big role. And the very rough thought then is, well, if these mountaineers are actually very competent at what they're doing, why do you think, therefore, that what they're doing could not be justified? Precisely because they're very good at dealing with these kinds of risks. It's at least going to place the onus back onto the opponent to say that that's not correct and to give an argument against that. And also, if all competently overcome mountaineering endeavours were unjustified, then I think that by a similar kind of line of reasoning, then any competently undertaken activity with a similar level of risk, however low that might be, would end up being unjustified. And that just looks to me like a very implausible assumption, especially when the risks might not be very high in mountaineering or these other activities. Okay. So that's, I guess, the first part is really, I guess, the main thing, but it's just a kind of an add-on claim. Okay. One final thing. So, started off by mentioning that question, why do people climb? Well, I'm going to preface the answer to this, which is probably fairly predictable by now, by saying, mentioning or making a public health warning. I'm not saying that you should go out and take lots of risks, okay? But why climb? Why is it worth it? Well, because it's risky, and I think that sometimes it's just good to take risks. That's the kind of the punchline. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
So has anybody got any questions at all, I suppose?
So when you have risks, are they risks because, I mean, I understand why they're risks because you might fall off or whatever, but is the reason that you like risks because you're scared of them or like because it's a challenge? Because I feel like that must come into it somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to vary from person to person. It's a really interesting question. I think part of it for some people is that they just like this particular kind of challenge, and given that the overcoming the risk might be a constitutive part of overcoming that kind of challenge, they do kind of quite like the risk. But it's kind of interesting because climbers very rarely say, if you ask them, why do you climb? They would very rarely explain the answer by actually explicitly saying, because it's risky. So they wouldn't kind of act under the description, I do this because it's risky. But nonetheless, I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that risk plays that kind of motivating role, and it also, hopefully, it might be valuable as well. But yeah, I mean, so you made two suggestions, and I think either of them could be true. It could be due to the overcoming of challenge, but some people, I guess, are at some level kind of turned on by the risk, I think. And that's why they often don't find other sorts of activities where there's a different kind of risk, like driving a car recklessly, why they don't find that as gratifying or fulfilling. And I think that, yeah, I mean, there are going to be other kinds of possible motivations with that as well. So, I guess as a kind of slightly quasi-physiological explanation, people can become addicted to risk as well, and that might sort of give a non-philosophical answer as to why people do it. I mean, there's going to be lots of possible explanations. I'm going to try and think more about some of these possible answers. I guess what I've just been assuming so far is that whatever the correct explanation for different people will be, then it does seem to play some kind of motivation role. I'm not sure if that was entirely satisfactory as an answer.
Well, I just wondered if you get scared.
Right, yeah.
Because I kind of...
Mountaineering
is for everyone. Like, I'd do it to prove a point, but I would, I'd be very frightened that I'd fall off or get hurt or
Yeah. So I think, I've never met or read about a mountaineer who's not been pretty terrified at some point due to the risks and what that can bring. But also, I guess the more confident that the mountaineer becomes, the less risky that certain kinds of easier climbs are. And maybe that's also partly why they also carry on trying to push the limit and climb harder things. They also do that because they want to actually just climb harder things. I don't think risk is the only part of the explanation. But yeah, I think most climbers are scared, and some of them, they kind of hate it at the time, but they kind of love it afterwards. That's a very common feeling and reaction.
I was wondering, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with your point, but I had a question about the example you used before about the counterfactual, saying, oh, if we made it a lot safer by having this rope and so on, would you do it? And people saying no. And I was wondering that maybe at least that example is based on confusion between riskiness and difficulty. And maybe the important thing, as you're saying, is competency, but competency is overcoming difficulty and not necessarily about overcoming risk. So if you said to them, the mountain is just going to be just as hard to climb, but for example you have superhuman strength and non-brittle bones, and if you fell off you wouldn't die, but actually if you weren't any good you just wouldn't get to the top, would you still want to climb it? And I actually think, I don't climb personally yet, but I actually think lots of people, that would then still be a challenge to say, am I good enough that this very, very difficult thing, can I do it? In which case then it wouldn't necessarily be about the risk at all, it would be about the difficulty. And of course it can be a bit contrived then, because I think it might be a problem of imagination. Because you might say to someone, imagine it was just as difficult but not as risky, but actually that's very hard to imagine for most people. So maybe then they're saying, oh, I still wouldn't do it. But that's because they just think, well, for it to be non-risky, it would just have to be easier.
Yeah, thanks. That's a nice question. I think I'm going to try and say two things about it. So, if the person was had super strong bones and they knew that however they climbed it, if they could climb it, that they weren't going to actually die. I suspect that lots of climbers would indeed say, yeah, I'll nonetheless do this. So that does indeed suggest that risk is not maybe the only thing, or at least not always even anything to do with it itself. I think that's absolutely true. I guess I also want to say, though, what was my second thought? It's completely eluded me. Yeah, so some people are motivated by, amongst other things, the difficulty. As you say, it's often very difficult to actually take away the difficulty. So often when people climbers are really just focused upon the technical difficulty of something, what they tend often to do is a comparatively safe form of climbing, which I've called sport climbing. And that is a lot safer, at least in terms of the seriousness of the kind of injuries or even death that's likely to occur. And you're also right that that kind of thought experiment is slightly kind of convoluted in the way I presented it. I guess I'm just kind of still thinking, though, that you can't in practice always take away the difficulty from the risk side. But given that people don't always make things less risky than they do, they don't always minimise the risk as much as they could, and that at least provides defeasible evidence for the idea that there's something about risk that does play a part in why they do it. So I think I didn't actually mention, but yeah, I wasn't saying this is conclusive evidence, it's kind of some evidence, but there are other sorts of explanations exactly like that. So why do they climb more risky things? Well, because they tend to be more difficult, is the alternative explanation. As I say, I don't think that can be the full explanation, because there are other ways to go through those really difficult sorts of climbs, at least in some contexts, by sports climbing, or climbing a different kind of style which is comparatively safe. But I mean, I grant your point that there are other possible explanations.
I'm just wondering what risk actually implies. I'm not sure that risk, when climbers are climbing, that they really think there's a risk of dying. I think there's a risk of scaring themselves. but it doesn't mean they're committed to risking dying. So that, in a sense, they're not actually prepared to take the fatal risk. They're just prepared to give themselves the experience of the fatal risk.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's true that when they're actually climbing, they tend not to think about death very much. It probably wouldn't be very good for them to actually be doing that at the time. On the other hand, when you actually, I think, when I've climbed and on people I've read on this, they do sort of have a certain kind of awareness that if they stuff up here, then it could really be fatal. But I guess whether or not they actually think that, the idea is that were they to actually fall, they could well die. And in that sense, the risk is there, whether or not they actually present it to themselves in those kinds of terms. So there's the kind of the two issues as to whether the risk is there or whether they perceive it to be there. And I agree that a lot of the time, although that risk of death, say, is there, it's not forefront in the climber's mind, but sometimes it really is. And sometimes that's actually when everything sort of, they can feel that sort of feeling alive sense, that kind of, especially in the zone, that kind of meditative kind of quality. At least that's something I get from a lot of stuff I've read.
So say someone does die on the mountain, do you think the other climbers would think that that was okay? That was just a consequence which is inherent in the expedition?
They tend to be very upset and disturbed when that happens, put it that way. I think there is a certain kind of sense within mountaineering communities that these things happen, and it's a real shame when it happens. But mountaineers often say, well, at least he died doing what he loved doing. And it's also going to depend on, I guess, the nature, the circumstances in which the person died. So if it was something that the person made a real mistake, though, I think that's really, kind of, in a sense, even more unfortunate that they were being so incompetent in leading to their death when they needn't have been incompetent in that way, given that they are actually more generally very competent. So it's going to depend on various sorts of other factors like that. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, sort of looking into the psychological perspective of being mountaineering.
Yeah, I mean, there are also other kind of interesting factors here as well. So there's a very well-known British female climber called Alison Hargreaves who died. And a lot of the reaction to her dying was a lot worse, or a lot more kind of vehement in the criticism she got than when male climbers died. And part of the idea there, and there's this kind of sexual bias going on because she's perceived as a mother who has to protect her children. And it's kind of maybe biased in a sense, because it's worse for her that she's treated in a way that she's worse than, say, men who are also fathers are treated. And so, yeah, I mean, there are lots of different kind of perceptions about, that depend on the particular circumstance in which the people died. And lots of interesting issues there.
So you know, you're talking about the ethical, maybe that it could encourage good ethical things.
Yeah.
Do you think that the type of courage that comes from mountaineering and taking those risks is kind of can you apply it to other types of risks? So, like, for example, as a mountaineer, would you be braver than someone else in driving a car recklessly or something like that? I know they don't bring the same kind of happiness, but I don't know. I feel like it's quite a specific type of risk, and I wondered if it translates to anything else, or is it just mountaineering?
I suspect that I actually don't like even talking about courage in mountaineering. It seems to me the wrong sort of word. It seems like it's too associated with virtue, whereas there's a sense in which climbing mountains is kind of unnecessary. Courage doesn't seem to be, when it's a quality, it doesn't seem to me to be the product of something unnecessary. But in terms of the kind of general, does that sort of quality transfer? I mean, a lot of climbers I know drive really, really badly and recklessly fast. I'm not sure that's courage again either. I mean, it could be more the result of a general sort of risk-taking propensity, as opposed to, so it could be the kind of the propensity to take risks and then actually gets them to do it, as opposed to taking risks then cultivates the quality of courage as such. But I suspect also that it does transfer in some other ways to some other sorts of activities. So people often, so some mountaineers go base jumping, and skydiving and so on. And I mean, these are things I kind of don't like the idea of falling, to be honest. So I kind of want to go bungee jumping, I want to go skydiving, but I don't really. In that sense, I don't know if I'd even call myself courageous in the mountaineering context, but to the extent I am, I'm not sure it does transfer to me. But different mountaineers, I guess, will be different again. Perhaps they are kind of more risk orientated, whatever the word would be. They have that propensity towards it. But yeah, I mean, again, I guess different people would be different.
I was wondering whether, because you were saying how the important thing is his level of competency. I was wondering, don't activities simply become less risky the more competent you are? So there will be people who aren't competent, it is risky, but they ought not to be climbing. And there are people who are competent, but then it's just not risky, and that's okay.
Imagine that I'm currently not very good at climbing, and this would be a very risky thing for me to do. But then I become more and more competent, and climbing at the same level, doing the same route again in 5 years' time, might not involve anywhere near as much risk or danger as it did then.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of mountaineers will be or people who do go climbing and mountaineering will be quite happy to get to that kind of level of competence and then not carry on pushing the grade and trying to climb harder and harder things. And I guess the very best climbers then do carry on trying to become better and better. So in that sense, even though their competence and their ability improves and increases, the risks that they take will also increase because they're climbing harder things where they're more likely to fall off and so on.
But then I'm not sure that, because the importance of competency that you had in that slide before was that they were warranted in thinking they could overcome the risks. And that's true if you get good at one sort of climb, but then you're not warranted if it's a harder climb. But then I'm thinking, well, maybe it doesn't have a value then. Maybe that's just thrill seeking in a way that isn't justified.
Okay. So I guess the thought is that there might be people who've climbed a big Himalayan face, and it was tough. But they thought by the end of it, yeah, we did that pretty competently. We're good at this. And then they might look at a different line and they think, okay, we're pretty confident that we can do that. We've studied the route. We know what it's going to involve. We know it's going to involve lots of risks apart from anything else. But mountaineers are typically pretty good at actually judging the level of the risks that are involved. And so a lot of them will turn back if it gets to a stage where they go, no, this is just too risky. So I think in that sense, there's not that kind of worry.
But were they competent enough to do it, or were they not competent? Because that's what I worry about. Like, either they were competent, in which case it just wasn't that risky, or that they weren't. And I suppose you can say, well, I did this climb, I confer I am competent enough to do that one. But then I worry we're getting ourselves into a situation where it just wasn't that risky.
Right. Okay. I guess even if you're competent, the risk still remains because something could go wrong. But you could still be justified in believing or warranted in believing that you had the skill and the ability to overcome it. That something could have just gone wrong. You could have just slipped due to lack of attention at a key moment or something like that, even though it's still true that you did have the competence. Does that kind of then answer your worry?
And then I suppose that I might partly agree with your conclusion then, because that's true of everything. It's risky walking down the stairs, but luckily we're all generally speaking competent enough to do it. But of course you put one foot wrong and you could fall down and you could lose your death. I suppose then the objections to mountaineering is that people think that they're competent when they're not.
Yeah.
In which case, I mean, if I really believe that someone could competently climb, it would only be a mistake that would cause their death, or something they couldn't control anyway, then I would say, yeah, sure, it's justified. But I suppose people who object to it are you're never competent enough. You can never, only allow for those certain sorts of mistakes.
I think that is kind of getting to part of the root of why there is often this disagreement between mountaineers and non-mountaineers, because non-mountaineers don't understand the competence and the experience that mountaineers actually have in what can look like really horrifically terrifying sorts of situations. But these are the sorts of things that mountaineers, through experience, are quite competent, usually often at engaging with and overcoming. So, yeah. Well, I'm glad that you kind of agree if that's the case. I mean, there is a worry here, though, I think, a potential worry, whereby does this account of competence kind of extend too far? So am I now committed to saying that walking down the stairs is really valuable, etc.?
Yeah.
There's a lot to be said about this, and I haven't thought this through fully. I think different kinds of competences are going to be relevant to different sorts of activities. I guess that's the first stage. And what I'm saying about mountaineering competence need not be true in other kinds of situations. I also don't want to say particularly that being able to walk down the stairs, for most of us at least, is a particularly worthwhile or valuable thing. But on the other hand, it seems that we are justified in doing it.
It's very useful.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to say it's justified because of the risks, though. The risks are pretty minimal. It just seems to give the wrong kind of explanation for why that would be valuable. Usually walking down the stairs is valuable as a means to something else, whereas what I'm suggesting here around risk, it's not a means to something else.
I'm still not necessarily convinced by that. Yeah, because I still think that, you'd say, well, competency therefore is important. Why is it important? It's important because it's difficult to do. And doing difficult things, I think, is definitely something that everyone will see as valuable.
Mm.
But then if you say to somebody, well, why are you doing something that is deliberately pushing your competency such that it is risky? I'm not sure what the answer is, because you could do lots of other stuff that would be difficult.
Okay, yeah. So I guess part of the idea then will relate to these sort of wider goods that I'm hoping that people will agree are valuable, like the kind of quest for adventure and so on, and also expressing yourself as an agent. And if mountaineers are indeed the kinds of people who really do get thwarted when they can't climb, and that the best way for them to express their agency is through climbing, and insofar as the climbing necessarily involves overcoming these risks, then I think you can give that kind of answer there, which is not going to simply reapply, given that walking down the stairs isn't typically a great kind of way to express your agency or to be adventurous and so on. So again, it's going to come back to that kind of constitutive idea of how risks involved in these sorts of activities, but not others. But you're not convinced?
That I think then it boils down to thrill seeking, and I think that there's probably an argument from autonomy that people thrill seeking is okay if that's what they want to do, but I can then see why people would object to it as a bit. I mean, you might start wondering whether it's just a bit unfortunate that these people can only find this sort of pleasure and exhilaration from something that happens to involve some risk. That's their agency and the overcoming of difficulties is something they only want to do in this particular way. Maybe it'd be better if we had the experience machine and we could make them think that they were doing it, but they weren't at any risk at all.
What was I going to say? Can you remind me what you said sort of like 10 seconds before the end? The second last point.
It seems a lot like thrill seeking.
That's it, yeah.
It seems sad that that's the only way they can find this.
So, I guess one thing I do want to admit to or agree to is that it could be true that climbers are to some degree risk seekers. What I guess I'm objecting to really is the spin on that, according to which they are thereby reckless simply because they enjoy taking risks. Because they can enjoy taking these risks and take those risks very competently. Is it a shame that they're kind of like that? I don't know. I suspect. Is it a shame for them? That's a very difficult question to know how to answer. It would be, I think, put it this way, it would be a real shame if there weren't people like that, because so many great achievements would not have actually happened. So, I'm kind of being biased here. I think that, say, getting to the top of Everest or getting to the poles, these were great achievements. They kind of represented something important about the human spirit and so on.
But then isn't the risk instrumental? because it's wonderful that they got the job of Everest, but it's not wonderful just because they experienced risk, they experienced difficulty, but that's...
Yeah. So I'm certainly not trying to say that risk is the only thing that contributes to the value or justification of mountaineering. So there'll be all these other sorts of things. But I did want to say that you could not actually have these kinds of adventure or these kinds of experiences without the risk, so in that sense it's not merely instrumental. So I don't think it lapses.
Okay, sorry, I know that I'm asking tons of questions now. Do you mean that you can't have it necessarily, or do you mean in fact, like there's just in our world currently, seeing as I can't make people see the human, like you just couldn't have those sorts of difficulties and challenges without the risk? Or do you mean something more essential and necessary than that? That even if you could have those things, that you'd still be missing?
Yeah. I was meaning it in the weaker way.
Right.
So given the kinds of creatures we are and the kind of world that we do inhabit, I mean, so I think people can get into disagreements about this, but I guess that's the kind of way I approach ethics, because it's all these sorts of justification, evaluative matters, because we're actually trying to talk about real people and real circumstances here. Which kind of raises a methodological issue about whether I'm entitled to those sorts of thoughts and experiments. But on the other hand, if we understand that these merely as kind of providing defeasible evidence, or those questions that we actually have asked mountaineers provides defeasible evidence, I think that's legitimate. But the more kind of thoughty, experimental you get, and the more kind of metaphysically crazy you get, the more worried I become anyway. Yeah, thanks.
Nobody else have any questions?
It seems like more than risk alone and more than competency. It's you said that people wouldn't do it if it wasn't challenging, and it seems like it's all about the challenge. That's where you get the exhilaration from. But that risk is a necessary part of the challenge. So it's not just about being reckless and seeking risk. It's about overcoming a challenge, which wouldn't be challenging if you didn't have a risk.
Yeah.
Does that sound fair? Would that be more believable?
Yeah. And I think that goes back to you saying, that is about the real world, that maybe there's just no way of making it that difficult without having a level of risk. And that I can accept. I suppose if I was, the thought experiment that I came up with was, thinking, what if we really could take away that risk? Would it still be
It wouldn't
enjoyable?
be a challenge then, presumably, if it didn't have the risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be a
As
different
it
kind
could
of challenge, but
yeah.
I mean,
Because if you were just in it for the challenge, you would go to like a climbing wall or something. So
that's a very nice way of kind of putting it.
So one more. How do you think climbers and mountaineers in general approach kind of uncontrollable risks versus controllable risks? So if there was a mountain that there's a 99% chance of avalanche, would they see that as kind of equally as thrilling as a face where there's 99% chance they'll fall off because it's beyond their capability?
So assuming that they're aware of the risks in both cases, I suspect that in both cases, if the seriousness of the loss would be pretty similar as well, so serious injury or death, then most mountaineers, insofar as they have the option, would not approach those climbs.
If it wasn't 99, then if it was kind of, if the risks were acceptable but equal, which would be kind of the more...
Yeah, so I mean, I think just an empirical matter of fact, climbers tend to stay away more from the avalanches.
Yeah.
And I think that's precisely as you put it, because those are kind of uncontrolled or not within the control of the climber. Whereas at least they've got more control, and certainly more of a sense of control, when it's a matter of, say, overcoming the technically difficult section of rock or whatever. But that's interesting as well. And I guess probably why they might think that is that they just think that it's less of a gamble, basically. So I guess one of the sorts of things, I didn't really make explicit, but one of the things I was trying to do was say that contrary to a lot of views that are often presented in the media, mountaineering is not just an utter gamble in the way that, say, Russian roulette is, because it involves these things like competence and so on. And that's inevitably going to have to involve some kind of real control over your situation. That sort of goes away when avalanches are involved. Even if you can move really quickly through the avalanche area, you can't eliminate that kind of risk entirely. And mountaineers aren't motivated by avoiding avalanches as such. They're motivated by what I'm saying. They're motivated in part by climbing things which involve risk, risk of falling off, etc.
But those risks are specifically the risks they're able to control rather than just the general roll of the dice.
Yeah. But they do often take risks knowing that there is going to be this avalanche thing, and they just try to move through it very quickly. But they tend not to like those risks.
Seems like that kind of choice would distinguish the risk seekers from climbers, like generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of cases it keeps.
Yeah. Okay, there are no more questions. Then I think we'll call that a conclusion. And I'd like to ask you a hand.
Thank you very much for your questions. It's really useful, and I found it fun.
Thank you.